Good morning. Thank you all for joining us for our second seminar. This is about to preserve or restore. How do you make that choice and why? And how circumstances vary depending on the car and what you're going to do with it. This is our 51 Buick, and this is going to be our case study, if you will. But first, I want to introduce our panelists. We've got David Burrows. Would you raise your hand, please, David? David is the man behind Bloomington Gold, the Survivor Car Show. He, in the United States, has been one of the earliest proponents of unrestored cars and not going too far with a car. Next up, we have Malcolm Cullum. Malcolm is the chief conservator at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, but he's not just in the air. He had many years at the Henry Ford as one of their conservators, and he really knows what he's doing when it comes to cars, planes, trains, you name it. Then we have Mark Gessler. Mark is the president of the Historic Vehicle Association. He's a collector. He's been a voice in the wilderness for preserving cars and keeping their heritage, and he's behind a national movement to name cars as, what's the word you'd use?
National Historic Vehicle Register.
Okay, the National Historic Vehicle Register. Next to Mark is Tim McNair. Tim is one of the leading detailers in the United States. He works on unrestored cars, restored cars, and cars that he's prepared have won the top concours. We have Warner Meyer next to him. Warner had spent 30 years as a GM engineer, so he has a good mechanical background. When he retired from that, he went into restoration of important American cars, Corvettes, muscle cars. He knows what it takes to put a car back together. Then we have Brian Joseph, who should really need no introduction around here. He runs the car selection committee for this show, but he's also a noted restorer and really an authority on exotic and classic cars and one of the leading suppliers of Duesenberg parts. So we have a varied group here, and hopefully they can shed some light for us on when to restore and when not to. So it's easy to ask that preservationists preserve. It's easy to think that preservationists preserve and restorers restore. Brian, is there ever a time when you recommend against restoration?
I always recommend against restoration. I think that it's a phenomenally expensive ordeal to go through. It takes a lot of time. And if the car has previously been restored, I have a good chance of going to the car and finding a lot of things that are wrong with it. So I would say a restored car has a much better chance in my mind of being re-restored and being improved. But when you have an original car, this car is a little bit questionable because it's so deteriorated. But if you had an original car that was totally usable, I don't think it's really right to restore the car. You can never make it original. You can't find a lot of the pieces that the car was made from. And the cost to really do it is just astronomical.
Would you agree, Warner? Do you have the same approach when you restore a car or look at a car?
Absolutely. My focus is probably a little different. I'm more of a user than a saver. I think that restoration is. We should probably let Dave Burrows define restoration, because most of what we do in our business today isn't restoration at all, it's enhancement. And I don't think every car should have that done. However, I do feel that these are cars and they're interesting and exciting, and the hobby should be supported, and the way to do that is to keep these cars operational. I like people that like to drive their cars. I like people that welcome young kids to touch their car, get in it at a show instead of screaming at them, "Don't touch my car." I think that this hobby is going to procreate itself a lot more. if my grandson likes to go for a ride with grandpa instead of being terrorized by some of these people that are afraid that this child is going to touch it. So, so I'm not, all for restoration, but I am for maintaining the car in a safe and operable condition.
Malcolm, do you think that when a car is in a museum setting versus a private ownership, that the criteria for preservation versus restoration change?
Well, absolutely. I mean, in a museum setting, we have, it's not just our personal interest in what happens to the car and our own personal joy in restoring or preserving or just detailing a car. We have a broader sort of responsibility to society, who either pays taxes for supporting the Smithsonian with the Air and Space collection. So everything that I do is with that in mind. I don't want future generations or even the public to think that the artifacts that are in my care are being miscared for or being overly restored. They want to know that the Apollo 11 command module that went to the moon and came back is still the exact same command module, that we didn't change out parts, we didn't make it freshened up so the visitors can get a better sense of what it looked like before it was launched. So I'm all about preserving history, preserving the patina of where the experience that artifact went through. But when you get into sort of lower caliber artifacts, things that don't have this outstanding residue of history, then it gets a little more cloudy.
Is that very close to your philosophy, David?
It is. The thing I would encourage people to look at is it shouldn't be looked at as an argument, restoration versus preservation. I look at an analog between the medical field. There's a difference between preventative medicine and surgery. So you don't do surgery if you don't need to. You don't do a restoration if you don't need to. The trick is figuring out where's that dividing line that says whether I need to or not. So I think restoration shops are incredibly important, and I don't like it when they're pitted against each other. I think good restoration shops are essential for preserving history. Well-preserved cars are extremely valuable to restorers because that's the template from which you can use to go forward and do things accurately. I think that the important thing is that the owners of automobiles understand when you use either one. It's not either or, it's more of a continuum. Maybe part of the car stays preserved, maybe part of the car gets rehabilitated, maybe part of it even gets restored, and possibly even part of it gets replaced. So it kind of depends on what's the overall view of the specific case you're looking at.
Well, Mark, you're in an interesting position because you're the driving force between designated vehicles almost as national monuments in a way. What's your take on when you preserve and when you do something to a car?
Well, first I want to clear up that it's what we're doing with the National Historic Vehicle Register absolutely recognizes restored cars. And it's not just about preservation. I mean, preservation is a great thing. Love to see original finishes, love to see that. But it's not what it's about. So just to clear that up first off. I mean, I think cars like this are all, it's a gift from the past, and you have to treat it as that. And I don't think, you sometimes buy wine by number, you sometimes buy cars by number in terms of condition, but the story trumps it all. And there's a story here that needs to be uncovered. I don't know what that story is, and I think that that's far more compelling. And I think that's where things are going. You don't take Hemingway's transcript, erase it, retype it, and have something better, even if you use the same words. And I think what we're doing I think we're at an interesting time where many cars have been restored. So you are actually at a point where very few have been unrestored. And of course, the best candidates for restoration have always been the best unrestored cars. And I mean, I did this myself. I restored a number of cars over the years, and that's what I was looking for. And I'm sure that that's what everybody else here is looking for. But I think we're now at this tipping point where there's just so little of it left, and it's a really compelling story when you see it. So, it's all about that story. It's about uncovering that story and how that artifact fits into that storyline.
When it comes to physically evaluating a car, Tim, as a detailer, you're probably in a unique position. What do you do? Do you weigh the story against the condition of the car? Do you look mostly at the condition of the car and see what you can save and what you can't save?
Well, I think a lot has to do with a dialogue with the owner as to what his goals are with the car. There are plenty of people out here that would like to, that have a reasonable sized budget to take a car to Pebble Beach or Amelia or something like that, or even St. John's. And they want to spend all the money and have the car basically better than what it was or whatever the case may be. When I see a car like this, which I'm seeing more and more often, actually this car looks like I've already worked on it, judging by the burn marks in the trunk. But just to give you a quick story, it's kind of interesting. A couple of years ago, I had done an unrestored AC Bristol for someone that we took to Pebble Beach. The car was, and if I get the story right, this owner had to interview to get the car. It had 48,000 miles on it.
Yes.
And my job at the Simeon Museum, where the car was being photographed, was to clean the car up, but don't wash it, don't clean it, don't wax it, don't polish it, don't do anything to it. Okay. So I got 2 spray bottles, one with distilled water and a little car wash soap, natural sponge, and about 7 hours later, finished this ACA's. I spent a lot of time getting wax out of crevices and taking the crud off the chrome on the dashboard and off the wire wheels, which is another adventure. But the bottom line was we took it to Pebble Beach and won first preservation. It was Mr. Gessler's car that we did this with. It was phenomenal. Cars like that, when you see them in that condition, the owner was fastidious in that had every receipt. It had the original telegram from Western Union saying the car was on its way to the United States. There was just so much that went with this car, and it would be a shame to change anything from where it was. On the other hand, I've been on the other end of the spectrum, which I maybe shouldn't, I won't get too involved with it, but I've been in positions where I've had to take cars that were in original conditions, such as this, and let's say the client wants to take it on an event, Colorado Grand, New England 1000, the Amelia, whatever it may be. Well, a car that sits for more than 30 years is not in good shape, and a lot of the parts need to be replaced. So when you're replacing, in this particular case was a Ferrari, when you're replacing new or old Coney shocks with new Coney shocks and replacing rubber bushings, we wanted to maintain the overall effect of the car. So the complete car was unrestored, but we had to do this stuff to make sure the car is drivable, roadworthy, and of course we didn't want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg on the tour. So I was hired to sort of patentate all the parts. So we made the car look, when we replaced these parts, they were made to look old, and the car still has the original feel of the car. Say as you want, in some cases people say it's fraud. In the other case, it's the car is back where it should be. I agree with Warner in the fact that cars are meant to be driven. This guy loves the way the car looks. It's his job. The onus comes on him, really, as to how he wants the car to be presented, and that's what he wanted. And he still drives the hell out of this car all the time.
Well, you raised a very good point. You spoke of the AC Bristol. Everything was documented from day one.
Yeah.
It had a story, a wonderful story. This, though, is a car that was picked up at auction. Nothing is known about it. The entire story will unfold as you look at it. That's all we have. So now we have to determine, okay, what is a responsible approach for this car, understanding that every car needs a different approach. But I'd like you folks to take a look at this car and tell the audience your take on what to do with it. Do we have a volunteer to go first?
I'll go first. I looked the car over. This is the first time I've seen this car before, and this isn't a car to be preserved completely. You can't drive the car on those tires. They're going to blow out on you if you do. We're assuming the car runs. Let's just assume that mechanically the car operates. But if it hasn't been driven in quite a few years, the gas tank's filled with crud that has to be removed and cleaned. Now the problem is that the cleaning process is going to affect the finish on the tank, which is originally a lead-coated steel, and the lead can get dissolved off of it from the cleaning process. So you have to do something so it doesn't rust. So you're going to have to paint it. So that's a problem that you're going to be resolved. The brakes, I'm sure, are scrapped in the car too. They have to all be gone through. That you can hide everything. But if you're same thing, if you're making all new brake lines, what do you do about the brake line fittings that are the line nuts, which ones on this car are different than what you can buy today. So you're going to make new nuts because these are all rusty and destroyed exactly like the original ones? Or are you just going to go to Napa, buy some brake line, put it on the car, and make the car safe? Now you've gone to the point of changing some of the originality in the car to make it safe to drive. The windshield has a crack in it. You can't safely use this windshield. I mean, you can drive it, but it's going to crack more and more and more. So where do you get, I don't know if it's tinted or not, or just dirty, but some of these glasses, you can't get the same color tinted glass today that they made back then. So now you're going to go to a glass shop and say, I want tinted glass. They're going to give you some green cast glass where this seems to have more blue in it. Or are you going to go to a guy who makes glass and laminates it and say, I want to have this lamination color put in it? Because the glass is clear. The lamination process, the adhesive film that's in it is where the color comes from. So you're going to go from buying a piece of glass that's $40 to a $400 or $500 piece of glass just to keep the color right. So it really comes back to what's the use. Person who owns this car, or they want to keep it as nice as possible. The interior is probably salvageable. But those kind of items that have to be replaced, how do you keep them original and affordable? Because this car has some value, but it's not a $500,000 car. So whoever owns this car has to decide their budget first, has to decide their use second, and then try to put those two things to get the most bang for the buck. And the chrome on the car could probably be cleaned up and left alone, but the paint's falling off the car. And this car gets used and washed and cleaned. In a couple of years, half this paint's going to be off the car. So what's worse? Preserving the sheet metal underneath and not letting it get rusty, or leaving this paint film on it that's falling apart everywhere. So it becomes such a balance, every decision. And obviously, what are you going to do for a convertible top? You know, if you're going to do the top, how much of that chrome is so bad that you'd want to do it? And then if you're going to do it, you're going to have to do all the chrome because it's going to look funny with the one or two pieces done. And you have to do that before you put the top on it. So what you say, before you even get into this car, you're going to have a plan, a goal, both where you want the car to be when you're done with it and what you're willing to spend to get there.
I see you nodding to that, Malcolm. Would you care to add or?
Yeah, I mean, once you start opening that can of worms. I mean, in the museum world, we define it as the levels of intervention, and every car from this to really historically important things, all have their own set of circumstances. The history is certainly the strongest influencing factor. But once you open that can of worms, you start changing things, and you get this visual disparity that ends up. Are people okay with that visual disparity? At the Ford Museum, we had Old 16. The original footrest for the riding mechanic was long gone. You could still see the witness mark in the frame rail where it had been bolted on, so we knew the footprint of that. And the Helks had put on a little step, so it's just easier to get up into the car. And I decided, we have photographs of what this thing looked like. We know its footprint, and so let's make a replica of it. And we didn't want this brand new looking foot thing standing out and glaring at us from this overall beautiful patina that the whole car had. So we artificially patinated it. But all of that work is documented. We're totally transparent and honest about it. We stamped in HF, GV in the back with the date. So in the future, if the records ever disappear, we'll know that part is not original to the car. But with something like this, it's Brian touches on the complex issue of how cost comes into the factor. In the museum world, we try not to think about market value and the hard cost of doing this kind of work, but in the private sector, it can be the deciding factor. If you have strong sentimental value with something like this, if it had a real strong personal history, I've heard about people spending gobs of money on a market value $15,000 car, just because it had some strong personal, story. So.
Thank you very much. The way we're choosing who goes next, whoever nods the most between version, I think the nod winner, the nod goes to David.
No, I don't want the nod.
No?
No, I'm just kidding. If I had a client that came to me with that question, I would interview the client very carefully to begin with. I'm not interested in the car. I'm interested in you. You're the person that owns the car. I want to know why you have this, how you ended up with this, what you want to do with it. I'd want to know who you are. And if you said, this was the car that I finally found after tracking it for 40 years. This is the car my dad had. And this is the one that I chopped the top. I put a great big rip in the convertible top. And my dad was furious. And all the neighbors came over. And all of a sudden, this now means something. So now I know, just like Malcolm said, now I know what is driving you. Are you going to drive this to a cruise-in? No. I don't even care if anybody knows I have it. This is my dad's car. That's a whole different answer, how I would work with you compared to somebody who said, I just want a Buick convertible. I'll put the top down anyway. I don't care if there's a top on it at all. I just want to drive around in a convertible on nice nights. And I've always liked these cars. So they're different. I want to know who the person is. If it's a museum or a cruise-in person or a collector, who are you? Do you want me to go on? Because there's a couple more. There's a couple more things. And then, what's the historic background of it? Did it do anything significant historically? No, not really. So there's no real gain in intrinsic value. So it's really now to what Malcolm said. There's some sentimental reason. Then you have to make the next calculation. Where on the spectrum do you want to go? Do you want to make this a showpiece, or do you want to keep it just like it is, but make it safe that you can drive it every now and then? And you're perfectly okay with putting Napa brake lines in it as long as it's done competently. That's okay. You're not trying to make it a show winner. That's a nice alternative. So it depends on what's the history. Is it significant? Because if it's a significant historic thing that belonged to Dwight Eisenhower, there's a whole other way we're going to maybe take care of this or preserve it. If it's just a family car, well, that's a little bit different yet. If it's just a car that you bought at auction, you want to make it look a little better, maybe sell it. Just make sure that the restoration costs you put in it don't exceed the cost you paid for it, and the two together exceed what the market value is. So that's a real simple thing that I try to walk people through to begin with, just so they can kind of get their bearings, and then you go from there.
Yeah. Mark, what is the most important factor for you? The history?
Yeah, absolutely. First thing I would do, I mean, I can only tell you what, okay, so you gave me this card today. You just handed it to me. Okay, what am I going to do? I'm going to spend a heck of a lot of time figuring out the history. Now, we may end up with something interesting, and that'd be a bonus. That'd be an upside. But if we don't, I mean, if it's just, Joe sold it to Ed, and then Ed sold it to Mike, and then I got it. I really think it's still a cool piece. And I think it's a great piece because there's just so little of it out there. You got to, in this domain, I mean, there's 8,000 of these built or something on that order. 1% survive, probably, maybe a little bit more, maybe as many as 10%. Out of that, it's another 1% of that look like this, or that are even close to being operable in the way, in the shape that it is. So I think you should be honored to be out there as a steward, not looking for either a preservation award or a restoration award, and just be a happy steward of an interesting story. And that interesting story is that, well, we don't have a great story about Ed, Joe, and the other guys that bought it. I mean, we may have the documents, and they may be nice guys, but you do have the witness of time. And the witness of time is very captivating because you don't see much of it. So I think this is an easy answer. I think you make this vehicle operable. I think you look at the issues that Brian brings up on how you want to do that, and you be careful about that. I see no problem with putting a new top on there. I would hold on to as much of the old stuff as you possibly can. And it's a captivating story. It will be a captivating story. There are plenty of restored vehicles that look like this out there. This happens to be a great period of styling for Buick. The year before that, it was one of the biggest upticks in sales of any model. So and a lot of these styling points still exist today on the Buick line. So it's something that has been carried forward. So to me, I think it's relatively straightforward on, even if you gave it to me, and even if you just told me it's just an old car. Because I think there just isn't enough of this out there, and I think that we need to pass some of this into the future and have other people have the opportunity. So, you know, we're in the forever business in some way, all of us in this room. You guys are great stewards to heritage in your own way, and we need a little bit more of this.
Tim, with this particular car, what can you do for this car to make it possible for it to be, well, all that it can be?
Well, cosmetic, I think, first of all, cars like this, and again, it really falls back on the owner's wishes at this point, but you always want to err on the side of caution and make the car as safe as possible. So, I mean, to Brian's point, we absolutely, you know, replace the tires, even the windshield, even if we put a contemporary windshield in it, that's fine. But I think if the guy wants to keep the car in this condition and actually use the car, and wants to preserve as much of that paint as possible, I would probably do things, I'd go at this and polish all the chrome, and I do have some techniques to make the paint come up a little bit more shiny, I would say. But I would also talk to a body shop or restorer as to how to preserve the paint that's already starting to flake off of the rockers. Whether we use a sealer, I've seen people do that. I've seen people just clear over them, some rust preventative stuff, that kind of thing. But really, it's what's underneath this car that I would be most concerned about, not so much the cosmetics, which are relatively easy to improve. It's the mechanical end of it that is probably the biggest draw here. It really depends on his budget. I mean, this car may need a whole front end for all we know. Beyond that, I mean, the interior, I've seen a lot of these interiors. Unfortunately, a lot of times the padding inside the seats is completely wasted. There are people out there that I know that would take the seats apart, remove the old padding, put contemporary padding in or the same style in, at least to get them back so that they're actually usable. The leather can be preserved to a point. A lot of leather conditioners, rejuvenators, that sort of thing. And you'll probably get a little bit better. But bottom line is, it's really going to be how much use the car will get in the future.
If someone were to choose to use this car, and as predicted, the paint begins to get worse, is it appropriate at that point to do something about the paint? Who would like to field this question?
Well, I'll tell you that the paint's going to fall off the car soon. You know, if you look at the hood, it's all cracked everywhere. And the only thing you can do is either leave it and polish it and clean it and make it look as good as possible, or you have to strip it down to bare metal and paint it over again. And to that, it will last. You can't, there's really only two choices in the car.
Yeah.
And you're just going to have to pay your money and make your choice.
It's either now or later, is what it comes out to.
Right.
Either we preserve as much as possible, and your intent is to eventually repaint it, or bite the bullet, paint it now, move on.
Like David said, you got to talk to the owner.
Yep.
And identify what his ultimate goal is. Most of my clients are not preservationists. They come in and they want a top put on that, and they want it painted, and they want it shiny. And I have a lot of father and son talks with these people and explain to them that before we can make it pretty, it has to be safe, it has to be reliable, it has to be durable and comfortable before you make it pretty. And that means you got brakes, you got lights, you got steering that works, you got everything that there's a fluid inside there is a contaminant, really. I mean, ethylene glycol is eating away at the heater core, and it's going to dump all over your interior.
That's right.
The coolant's going to be on the floor. And if you don't have a good radiator in the car, you ain't coming home, so it's no sense going out.
Good point.
And so, likewise, and I've had people with an original interior, and they say, I can't stand driving this car, it stinks. And so,
that's the smell of history.
But
The smell of his.
you know, but some people are allergic to mold, and so.
Love the smell
So,
of mold in the morning.
yeah. So anyway, you know, I try to tell them that before they have to worry about painting and do these other things are all part of this equation that must be done first. Yes, it's best to do it in a synchronous manner. You don't want to put a convertible top on it this year and then go back to Brian and say, paint this thing now, because
That's right.
You know, the body shop's going to trash that. So you really want to look at your long-term goal, ultimately what you want this to look like, and take the most direct path to getting there.
And only have one path.
Yes.
Get a plan to begin with, and don't change your plan. It's just going to cost you so much money to change and
Oh,
say,
come
well,
on. Nobody ever changes. They bring their car in for a paint job, and it's the restorers that tell them that they have to have all this stuff replaced.
Well, we did one car for a guy, and the first thing we did was paint the outside of the car. And he's like, I'm never going to take my car to a car show. I'm drive it every place I go. Then he took it to a car show and he won something with it. And then he kept going to more and more. And then he bought a trailer. And then the next year he wanted us to paint the underside of the car, which was what you should have done first. And so the amount of effort we had to go through to protect what we had done the year before to satisfy his whims, you know, it's a lot of extra money. So that changing and not having a good direct plan cost him money. Now, he could afford it, and the car got done, and everything was fine, but knowing where you're going and sticking with your plan is very important to having a successful restoration.
I think David had a point.
Yeah, the problem, especially a person new to automobiles, an old pro probably wouldn't get in the situation, but newer people who buy cars like this, the problem is if you take all the paint off of it and put new paint on it, now my analogy is you just came off the football field with your shoulder pads, helmet, dirt stains all over, and you just put a brand new pair of dress pants on. You're going to look weird. You've got dress pants on with grass-stained football jersey. It's out of sync. As soon as this car gets painted, everything else is going to jump out like a sore thumb. Every little thing that's a flaw, you've just now amplified all those things against this beautiful paint, or even marginally good paint. If you get less than marginally good paint, it looks worse than it does now, and you've lost part of its character. If you take this to a car show, not a Concours, but a car show, I almost guarantee this will get more attention than one that's been repainted. So if you're after attention, if you want the crowd to come around and talk to you and make you feel like you've got something, this will get it. But I really caution people about if your paint is the largest percentage of any presentation of any vehicle, whether it's a steam engine, a fire truck, or a Buick, or a Ferrari, if the rest of the car is not in sync with that overall paint, all that other stuff is going to look horribly out of sync. And so where do you stop? And that's the trap I see people falling into. They go the paint route, and then everything else is out of whack, and then they come back around and do what they should have done in the first place. But nobody really explained what you're going to get into. And the novice or the person who doesn't have much of an understanding of this is really disadvantaged, is handicapped.
Well, another problem that happens with doing what you're talking about is that then you take your stainless moldings off the car, send them to somebody to polish them, and they bend them and warp them and ruin them. And then where are you going to get new stainless moldings? Or they pull the moldings off around the windshield, and in removing them, they bend them and wreck them because they don't know what they're doing. And one of the things that I see with a car like this is that all cars cost almost the same amount of money to restore because it's man hours there to do it. And to be able to take the car apart, properly restore it, not ruin the parts as you take them apart, and then have them refinished properly so they'll go back on the car. Anybody who's had any chrome work done will know what I'm talking about. You get your parts back from the chrome shop and they won't fit back together again because they have to have a certain size, and when you start putting plating on it, that changes the dimensions of the part. Well, that all costs a lot of money. And what's this car worth when it's done? And I don't see that this car is worth restoring, even though it's a unique, interesting car, to pay a professional like myself to do it, because you're going to have $200,000 to $300,000 in a restoration cost. And the car's not worth that kind of money. And I don't think it's going to be worth that kind of money in the future. So this is a real difficult choice to make because it's deteriorated to the point where almost nobody's going to be real happy they own it, because most people want bright, shiny things. But on the other hand, if you make it bright and shiny, you're not going to be happy because you spent so much money on it. So this car is really a difficult choice as an example. There's other cars like the Oldsmobile, Like that'd just be criminal to restore that 1911 Oldsmobile. But there's only, what, 6 1911 Oldsmobiles in the entire world? Well, you say there's some percentage of these. If there was 50 of these, that's 5 times more than the Oldsmobile. And so the rarity, the relative rarity of the car, I think, has to be a big factor on how much of it you preserve and to what degree do you go to the preservation of it.
The line I use on the customers is, do you love this car and hate your money? Because that's what it takes. If you want to, face it, the restoration cost will far exceed its value when it's done. And so that's the combination. To get a yes for them, before we start restoring it, he's got to agree that he really dislikes his money and loves this car.
I just want to add that I think the other another point here that I want to make sure that I make is that if you are going to go down the preservation route and maintain this car as it is, I mean, it's got, I think, that windshield, by the way, I think that was maybe one of the first years that they did the tint. So this may be one of the few cracked windshields out there that has that original stuff in it. But you're going to have to come to terms as to whether or not you can live with not using it as much as you would use a restored car. So there's a basic line in the sand. You are not going to be able to drive this around, or the paint is going to fall off, or a bunch of other things are going to happen that you are eventually going to end up in a restoration. And maybe that's fine for you too. You just say, I'll drive it until it needs it. That's fine too. But the whole idea on the preservation side, I think, would be that you are going to be limiting its use. And can you live with doing that? I've had a couple circumstances where I couldn't live with doing that. I mean, the AC, I wanted to drive it, I drove it, I ran over a stick, bumped up, hit the side of the car, I'm like, oh my God, I can't drive this car, I got to put it back in, and it was just too tempting, so it's gone. But I have some other preservation cars that they just stay. And but you have to ask yourself whether or not you can live with not really operating it, because if you're going to do that with the seats, you probably need to find another pair of seats. Put in another pair of seats, put these aside. Take off a bunch of stuff. I mean, you can kludge it to get yourself there, so you got something operable that you want to use and still maintain some of the finish on it. But you got to ask yourself, can I live with it?
You're right.
One of the things I find is even whatever decision's made, and if this car is meant to be kept in this condition, I got to tell you, 9 times out of 10, the car is only going to get another 100 miles put on it before they make their next decision on the car. If that. Sometimes they just go back in the collection, they had their fun with it, they're done, there it is. And then it sits for another 10 years, or it sits for the next auction. That's what I've been seeing with a lot of these cars. The allure and the draw to it being in this condition only goes so far, I think. Once that novelty wears off, then they start thinking about taking it to Brian or getting it fixed.
Well, I think that I have a car that it's a 1965 Maserati. When I bought the car, it had been hit in the back, bumper was bent, and like we said, when you start chroming something, pretty soon everything looks terrible. So we chromed the rear bumper, and then the front bumper didn't look so good, so we did that. But I left as much of the car as I could original. So like the entire engine compartment has the original finish in it. The underside of the car is still original. I did the mechanical restoration that needed to be done to the thing. My interior, the headlining's still the original headliner in it. The rear seat is all the original leather. My carpeting had been changed, which is one of the things I find with so many cars that come into my shop now is we don't get cars like this to be restored. People aren't restoring unrestored cars. People are re-restoring cars. And I had said to somebody earlier that is easier because most of those restorations are crummy anyway, so you're going to make them better. But that's one of the problems with this car is that if you're going to restore this car, you're going to have a hard time doing a really good job on it because of the economics of it. Because it's a complicated car. There's an awful lot of parts on the bumper. But I think that if you can keep the car mostly original and use it, I drive my car to work. It's almost 50 years old, and I don't keep my car, I keep it in the garage, but I don't care if it gets rained on. It's a car. And I use it as much as I can, and I drive it any place. In fact, we're driving it here today from my shop in Troy. But you're right that most of these people who have these cars, they don't use them very often. And so if your motivation is to have a nice original car, this car could be kept for 10 years and used fairly regularly and still look the same as it does now in 10 years.
Go ahead.
But I just wanted to bring up the fact that I'm just, from a museum standpoint, I'm pleased that, conversations like this are even happening. I think 20 years ago, there were, just assumptions that if a car came in like this, it was just assumed, so when are you going to restore it? Who are you sending it to? It just, preserving it as is wasn't even part of the equation. And I think that's something to keep in mind is that, the fact that we're even having this seminar and we got a full house, I think is great. That our philosophical approach to this, our material culture, the history of our motoring history is becoming more advanced. People are seeing these things not as just sort of things that they can impart their own fun with and restore with their son and make it a family thing or make it a personal source of ego and win trophies. There is a deeper understanding that, and there's also an aesthetic appeal which is developing as well. I mean, if this was my personal car, if I bought this at a local auction and I got this thing home and I realized how original it was, I would just take this out on the weekends with my wife and go out to dinner. And if I took this to a local car show, I think 20 years ago you'd have people picking your ear, So when are you going to restore? It looks pretty rough. But today you're going to get more and more people that are saying, this thing looks great. Let me see under the hood. This is a time capsule. And because that is becoming more and more rare, it's becoming more and more valued. In the museum world, these are just philosophical principles that we've always held. Preservation is our flagship, but those principles are slowly making their way into the private sector.
Now, one thing we haven't really touched on, we've talked about the personal motivation, the value of the car being a determining factor, but what about the value of a car like this as a template for other restorations? We haven't really touched on that too much.
Well, I'll tell you what, I look at only one thing when I'm restoring cars, and that's our original factory photographs. And whenever we're working on a car, and we work on all kinds of cars from the turn of the century up until slightly after World War II, but any restored car is wrong. They never should be looked at as a guide. An original car that's never been touched, yes, that is very important to have. There's things on this car that you can't buy, you can't replace, you won't be able to get it exactly right. So without a doubt, the fact that this car is a good, solid, looks to be fairly complete car, that to me is very important to preserve. Because if you had a restored car and you put that next to this car, you would find a lot of stuff wrong on the restored car that's correct on this car. And once it's been changed, that's lost forever. So I think that the value of this as a historical piece that is a good source of information, personally, is very important to me.
So it's not only a car, that is a rolling historic record.
Absolutely.
It's data.
To Brian's point, I've worked on a number of cars that are extremely low mile examples of cars. And most recently I had a car that's going to Gooding in Monterey, 3,000 mile Ferrari Daytona Spider. These cars are all over the map value-wise, but when you get a car like that, we spent hours just photographing the car. Up on a lift, we took pictures of all the hose clamps. This car's never been touched. It's had fuel put in it, it's had an oil change or two, air in the tires, but for the most part, it's been in a climate-controlled garage all its life. Lived a privileged life, which was nice, but that will not become any more correct than what it is. I find it extremely important that if you come across any car like that, whether it's a Daytona or a Buick that falls into that category, it's very important to make sure you document everything. You'll see, digital cameras are the way to go. You can sit there in 15 minutes, have more photographs than you know what to do with. But for future use,
have the one you need, though.
Oh, isn't it the truth? And then you'll find, every little hose clamp, every little finish. That's a big thing today is finishes on hardware. A lot of the stuff I'm doing now is correcting things. Back to Brian's point again, correcting these older restorations. We get a lot of cars. I just worked on a Sebring, Maserati Sebring, and of course I had Napa hose clamps, and you put the original Cheney hose clamps back on, and things like that, where you just bring it back to the way it was. And that the only way you find that stuff out is from factory photographs, which with the Italians is not always the best. But cars in period, road and track, car and driver, sports car graphic, magazine articles. Even then they were stacking the deck and sending special cars to road and track and car and driver to drive like they do today. But they also at some point, a lot of that you can glean that information, like hose clamps and finishes and things. But I think it's extremely important to make sure that that's documented and work off of as much original stuff as possible.
As a museum man, you buy that, I assume?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, with this car, if there were some subtle changes that were made, either as freshening up prior to auction, or if they wanted to quickly get it running just to show that it ran prior to auction, things that you might want to undo or get back to period correct, I think that's that's perfectly honest and straight up.
But there's a very important point that Brian made. If you do have to change the brake lines just to get it running and safe, keep those parts.
Yeah, keep everything.
Yeah. I mean, in the museum world, every part that ever comes off anything gets saved, even the most mundane thing. I mean, on the serial number 1 Mustang, we got that car up and running, and we had the old original oil filter and took it off, and it's got the date stamped on it from the original owner that had bought it. All these little subtle details that would have been thrown away 20, 30 years ago are now part of its cherished history. So when we run it, we obviously put on things to make it safe to run, but all those original parts, we had to change out some of the original brake parts, but all the inspection marks, all that stuff was still on all the original components, and that's still kept in the archive. So, and I remember the thing that really stuck in my mind was having these national judges that knew Mustangs like the back of their hand come out and go over that car, and they were just flipping out over how the certain trim piece went over the carpet and this and that, and this, these revelations. I knew it was like that from the factory, and everybody that restores it does it wrong. I mean, it touches on what Brian was talking about. Having these original reference pieces and with all those just seemingly trivial details on an original car, just invaluable.
Well, we have a car in the shop right now. It's a Duesenberg that had been partially restored by another restoration shop, and it came to us for some mechanical issues. So once we got through re-cam timing it and fixing the mechanical issues, we were looking at the way the car sits. And a Duesenberg rear spring, and most leaf springs are this way, there's a short end and a long end. The pin in the middle of the spring isn't really in the middle of the spring. And this car, the springs are on backwards. So the pin doesn't even fit in the rear axle. There's a hole that the pin's supposed to fit in to locate on the rear axle. And this is a well-known restoration shop that's done Duesenbergs before, and how they could have put the springs in backwards and not realize they were in backwards and not fixed it is beyond me. But now I have to fix that. And the other thing is that the car sits very low. It only has 8 leaves. It's supposed to have between 12 and 14 in the back. It only has 9 in the front. It should have 12 in the front. Now, why did that happen in restoration? And that's what I say. Every time I get a restored car in my shop that I know something about, because I get cars in the shop that I've never seen in my life, but the cars that we work on every day, they're always wrong. There's a ton of stuff wrong on a car. I always say, if you bring a Duesenberg in my shop that I didn't restore, or 2 other people that I know didn't restore, that you immediately are going to spend $10,000 replacing all the wrong hardware on the car. And that's the biggest problem you run into restoration, is that the people who are doing it don't do what's really should be done. Most restoration shops are really just paint shops. They're not interested in the history of it. They aren't intrigued by, oh my God, look at these fasteners. You're not looking at, like you say, the finish that's on a hose clamp. Was it, what is it?
Absolutely.
They're not even going to analyze it. They're just going to do something to it. And like now, you buy fasteners. On the cars that we work on, they all were cadmium, and they were made, the plating bath was made by the Utilite Corporation. So the finish is listed as Utilite. Well, if you don't know that, you don't know what it is. So now what people do is they put zinc on, because the government said we can't have cadmium on nuts and bolts. We get all the cadmium replated with cadmium, so when we do a car, it's the correct finish on it. But this has taken me years to get to the point to know exactly
And
what
finding the
it's
guy
supposed
to
to be.
do that and do it right.
Right.
That's the other problem.
Right, well, we have to go to an
lot of
industrial
work.
plater, and
Yep.
the thing is that we do business with this guy 3 times a week. We go there. But if you're restoring a car in your garage, he doesn't want to talk to you. He doesn't want to do one load. It has to be prepared a certain way. If you don't have the ability to prepare the parts first, all he is a plater. He takes clean metal, cleans it more, puts it in a plating bath, and gives it back to you. So the thing is that you have a disadvantage for the father and son restoration to go through this amount of time and the equipment. You know, I mean, we have sandblasters, glass bead blasters, and we spend, you know, I have a kid to spend weeks blasting hardware. Well, most people aren't going to sit there in a garage forever doing that. They don't have a big enough air compressor. They don't have the equipment to do it.
And the time.
And the time. And that is one of the advantages of leaving this car together, because it is the way it was built. There's no question about it. It's not as pretty as it could be, but you can't deny that it's real.
How about this for a scenario? I was hearing the other day about Alaskan salmon being sent to China to be processed and then sold back here in the United States. You think that's going to start happening with cars, where a lot of the environmental regulations are lax and the labor costs are cheap?
Well, they already do that. There was people sending cars to South America.
Yeah.
They were sending cars, I was Chile, where they
How
were
much metalwork is coming out of South Africa? I've seen 300 SLs, not the 52 300 SLs, the W194 body cars, complete bodies, Alfa Romeo bodies, early Alfa stuff. These guys do unbelievable work, and it's pennies on the dollar compared to what we could do in the States. And even if you bought an entire body, and it's this far away from being right, you know, it gets you further along than spending, you know, having your metal guys stand there and beat new panels.
Yeah, right.
It makes
the
a
other
whole lot
problem
more
you run
sense.
into too, though, I had a friend of mine was restoring a Porsche race car, and they templated another car.
Right.
And to think that that
Probably a
car
restored
was the
car.
same as this other car is crazy, because
Yep.
they weren't. Cars aren't made the same,
That's
especially
exactly right.
race cars, and especially an Italian or, you know, a handmade body. They can't possibly be the same from car to car. And yet these people go through elaborate efforts. They did this on some cords. We had the 810 cord in the shop, and these guys, one of them was a designer at General Motors, and in restoring his car, they went to this one car because they felt that this door was probably the best door for a template. And they made a template of it, and then they made all the other cars that same shape to the door. But those panels weren't made one at a time and then checked, and the surfaces all confirmed that they were right. They used whatever they had. They made some of the stuff where they stacked it up so the radiuses changed, because they would hammer the panels out 10 at a time, so the radius would change. And you can't necessarily go by that guide. So even like you say, if the panels aren't really right, well, they're not right between that and the car you looked at. It doesn't mean that really that they're wrong, because they made those bodies to a template. Where'd their template come from?
Does anyone have anything to add on this line of
One question would be if, I don't know how you guys would feel, but, and how the audience would feel, but let's say that the paint was just, I mean, disastrous. I mean, just almost completely off, so that we're there, I mean, it's a slam dunk, you've got to do something. How do people feel about putting new paint on it and then leaving the rest of it intact? And I know that that bothers a whole lot of people, and I guess my message is I'd like to encourage you to try to do that sometimes. Not, I mean, not that you guys aren't doing that, but that just that the audience would be, because there's value in the original interiors and things like that. You know, you're bucking a trend of not going out on the show field and winning something perhaps because of it, although I think a lot of judging is getting a little bit more respectful of original interiors.
Most judging sheets that I see today have a separate category for over-restored.
Yeah.
It's like right at the bottom line, you're walking your way through a judging scoring sheet, and right at the bottom it says over-restored, and you take
at
points.
Pebble
So-
Beach? You can lose five.
And I
points.
recognize,
I think you gain 5 at Pebble, don't you? It's not- You gain 5 at Pebble for over-restored.
well, and I know that there's this issue with, you know, well, the paint's popping and the chrome looks a little bit tired and all those sorts of things, but I you know.
Well, I restored a Bugatti, and the car had absolutely never been touched except it had been painted. The car was originally black, and it was painted like a cream color. And the client wanted the car completely restored. Well, here's a rare opportunity, a 1939 Type 57 supercharged Bugatti Stelvio with the complete original interior in the car in very usable condition. The top boot was there. And when we went to do this, all the hardware that holds the top boot on the car and the twist fasteners and snaps and every little piece of metal that was part of the assembly of that was all special. You can't buy that anywhere. You can buy a snap, but it won't have the same letters engraved in it. You can buy a twist fastener, but it wasn't the same. It did the same job, But we looked all over the world trying to find something that was closer. But you can't take those apart and put them back on. I mean, you could, but each one would cost hundreds of dollars to take apart, fix it, plate it, put it on when you did the restoration. And now there's a car that the exterior had been painted in 1956. What do you do with that car? I didn't like that we were replacing all this stuff in the interior because the fabric in the top was special. The lining inside the top boot was special. You can't buy that anywhere. And so all we did was put, regular modern material in it, the best thing that we could find, quality materials. But we destroyed all that history.
Was that done at the owner's request?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I do everything at the owner's request,
Sure.
They're paying me to do a job, and what they want, I run a business, and
That's right.
I try to satisfy my customers. But I might not like what I'm doing. And I try to talk people out of it. But if you want to show a car at Pebble Beach, you can't. I guess you could, but the owner doesn't think that's smart to paint the exterior and leave everything else.
Mm-hmm.
So we restored the entire car, but that's exactly where do you stop?
Before we move on, I think that we ought to listen to Dave Burrows a little bit because he's done for the sake of the people here, because I'm sure they've all got questions about cars that they know. And some of the most misused and maligned terms are those that he's clearly defined. And people think that every time they find a car that's been sitting in neglect for the last 20 years, they have a survivor.
Yeah, nobody wanted it then. Why did
And I think you've got the idea what these guys are describing as a survivor here. But a lot of people, I'm afraid, may be investing in a survivor that is clearly nothing more than a parts car. So anyway, Dave, I've been waiting for you to chime in on that subject because you do it so eloquently. So,
Well,
benchmark. Those are the
right.
words. Yeah.
The problem we have is that we have car enthusiasts who are mostly baby boomers who are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, and are used to cars being pretty much restored and kept up. And as I saw these things starting to leave about 30 years ago, I created an idea called Survivor. And Survivor, at that point in time, I had to explain to people what I meant by that, and I trademarked it. And Survivor is actually like FedEx or Scotch Tape or Band-Aid. Survivor is a federal trademark. It has been turned generically, just like Scotch Tape and FedEx. There's a definition for survivor. It's in the Patent and Trademark Office. People call this a survivor. Unfortunately, this is not a survivor according to the Patent and Trademark Office. This is an unrestored car. Survivor, by definition, in the Patent and Trademark Office, is a vehicle that's over 20 years old, is more than 50% unrestored, unrepaired, unmodified, and unrefinished. Third, over 50% of the vehicle is still in the condition that you can use the finishes and the color as a template for restoration. It has not been refinished. And last, it has to pass a 20-mile road test. So that's the definition by Patent and Trademark Office of survivor. You legally can't describe a car as survivor unless you run it through and get it certified, and it carries a little Circle R registered trademark. Now that's the official statement. FedEx is never going to prosecute you for saying, I just FedExed a package to somebody and you happen to use UPS, or you Xerox something on a Honeywell. And the same thing is true for Survivor. If anybody uses that in here, nobody's going to arrest you. But if you started to use that commercially, somebody could come down on you and say you can't do that because it's a federal trademark. So definition of Survivor has that, or the Survivor trademark has that by definition. Over 50% unrestored, over 50% of the finish is good enough to use as a template, and passes a 20-mile road test. And that's by definition. We also created a few more definitions called fingerprint. Fingerprint is over 75% unrestored, and over 75% of the finish is still good enough. And finally, zenith is 90% unrestored and 90% of the finishes in nearly new condition. So when you look at a car that's been zenith certified, it's basically a brand new automobile that's over 40 years old. So those are some definitions we put to it to kind of clarify things for people. So there's, you see something advertised, or you can ask the owner, give me by percentage. Don't tell me it's unrestored, but tell me by percentage.
Yeah, if I could just to add along this line, I think one of the great, or at least I challenge you to say one of the tragedies of all this is that we, and the HVA is as guilty as anybody, we're going to give a preservation award here this weekend. Okay, there's going to be one winner. And there's going to be a lot of really awesome stewardship that's gone on to hold some stuff in it, with its original witness marks, with its original finishes out there. And you know, I think this whole idea of, you know, whether it's a, you know, top grade restoration or top grade preservation, that's the ends of the scale, okay? There's a whole lot of room in the middle, and all of us fit right there. And what I'd like to sort of invite you or inspire you to think about is to be happy being in that middle, because you're preserving something from the past. And I hear this, you know, also in the prior group, you know, well, you know, once it's, you know, barn finds, they're something where it's obvious that you should be restoring it. Well, it may just depend on how old it is to change your mind. In our office, we have a 1915 Packard Twin Six, 7th oldest 12-cylinder car known to exist. It looks a mess.
It does.
It looks a mess. But I'll tell you what, I'd guarantee you, if you came by there, you'd probably tell us, don't touch it. We went back, found the story of why it looks the way it does, and it's pretty interesting. I mean, it was in a flood, all this sort of stuff, but we have, it's one of the only earliest Packards that has a known story. And I mean, 9 times out of 10 years ago, you say restore it immediately, and I think gradually and gradually, and I think it's really the same for a lot of other original stuff. And it's just not as old. This is, you know, this is only 60 years old. If it was 100 years old, I think you'd all say something, you know, we'd all feel a little bit different about it. And it's not going to be too long before it is going to be 100 years old, and there isn't going to be much of this left.
Well, we've made a lot of points that are food for thought. What I would like to do now is to open to the floor for questions and for our various panelists. We've got one here in the middle.
Thanks for your comments. It's been very enlightening. I'm struggling with a car I have that is a nice, fairly original, that has a very badly damaged quarter panel that really needs to be replaced. It's not fixable. At which point I have to decide the paint question. It's a mid-60s. I'm not sure you can get paint that will exactly match. The rest of the paint's sort of not great, not bad. Would like opinions on that, and especially if you do have to paint the car, single stage versus clear coats, and assuming that it's a, you know, it's a nice, interesting car, but nothing super special like this Buick, and I want to drive it. It's a 66 Chrysler Town and Country station wagon. About 45,000 miles on it. I'm the second owner.
Well, I would recommend that first thing to do is you have to match the color. Color matching is very difficult. We find that it almost never works when the paint store will come in and they have these cameras they photograph the paint with, and then they give you a formula and you spray that out. Sometimes you wonder who was on drugs when they did this because it's so far off. So before you do anything, and your car's probably painted with lacquer, it could be painted with it's enamel. Well, then those paint products are probably still available or close approximation to them. If you can find somebody who can mix and tint the paint, and you can do a spray out, and you hold it up to your car and you say, this color matches enough for me, for my ability to discern colors, because everybody's a little different there, then that's the first step you need to take. Because if you take your fender off, you then have to paint the thing. You have to get it done. Otherwise, you're going to have a fender that's either in bare metal or primer, and that's going to look pretty bad. So the first thing to do is spend the time now to get the color matched with a paint product that's closest to what you have on the car. And and I would not use a base coat, clear coat on your car. It's completely wrong. It'll look different. So you should be using a single stage paint. I think that Centauri still makes colors. There's other, I don't know who the other manufacturers are, but you should be able to find a product for your car, and a good, competent painter should be able to apply it and make it look fairly well. So it's not a question of that fender's going to be a big standout. You know, maybe it'll be a little bit shinier, but we actually did it on one car a long time ago where after we painted the car, we rubbed dirt in the paint so that you couldn't tell that this car had been painted on the quarter panel. So, I mean, that's patinating the part to try to make it look appropriate. But that's what I would recommend doing. And then I guess the biggest question is, where are you going to get a fender for your car? Well, that's good. So that's a start. So that's what you should do first, is make sure that you have a mix that's good, that you're happy with. And then I would get enough paint mix to paint your entire car so that you have it for the future, because in 5 years they may not still make those paint products. Seal the cans and put them aside and get your fender painted, and I'm sure that can be done in a satisfactory manner.
I'd start too by enhancing your current paint. Before you do the color match,
Right.
clean that panel up that you're matching to as well as possible, because one of the most, you could get the color exactly right, but it will have more gloss and distinctiveness of image. So you want the panel you want to match to, you want to have the best standard, because you get this flawless new polished piece, and your other stuff's going to look dull compared to it. So I would try to enhance that and then match to the most enhanced finish you can put on your car.
You should also be aware that colors shift over time. We're doing a German World War II light bomber that the colors completely shifted because of they were originally painted in lacquer, and as the lacquer aged, it became more acidic. It actually changed the colorant, so it shifted from sort of a greenish tone into actually more of a lavender tone, which is a very bizarre color shift. So it's important to find an area that's been protected from the sunlight to really get a true color match.
Do we have another question?
Hello. I got a couple questions for you. I work for PPG Industries, first of all, and the gentleman over here, they do make lacquer still and Delstar for your car. But, I have a 66 GTO that I'm the third owner. It's low miles. It's never been restored. The second person I bought it from took it from an automatic and switched it to a tri-power 4-speed car. But I have the original transmission, the manifold, the carburetors, console for the inside. Should I leave it the same as long as I have the other parts, or does that decrease the value?
Well, I think today, having a car that's been modified, like if you read in the sports car market, there's just been discussions about that, and what they were saying about car appraisers aren't authenticators. There's definitely more value in a car being the way it was built than somebody's dream of what they wish they could have bought, but they couldn't afford to buy it, so they bought something else and made it into that car. But putting it back to the way it was isn't going to be worth as much as a real car if your car originally was built the way it is now. So that's a call that, unless you're going to sell the car, I would leave it the way it is, because you like it the way it is. And the reason you own a car is because you like it. And that the value of it is an enhancement to that. But I don't buy cars I don't like. I want to have things that appeal to me. But since you have all those pieces, the main thing to do would be to keep them all intact, in good condition, so that the next guy can decide what to do with it. Why spend the time and money now to put the car to the way it was, which will then be less interesting to you, but the next guy, let him be aware of what he's buying and that you have all the parts, and let him then make the decision to put it all back.
I'd say, when was that? When was the changeover made?
Changeover was probably made about 10 years ago.
So it wasn't in period.
Wasn't it? It's not an in period. I was going to say, if it was an in period change, that's really cool. So, but this is clearly out of period. Last 10 years. I agree with Brian.
Okay, so if it was before that?
Well, I mean, if it was like within 10 years of its original use, so between 66 and 76, just to use a heuristic rule of thumb there, I'd say that was pretty cool. That's a period modification that somebody did, and it should be left. But if it was 10 years ago, that's well out of its normal use period. And you know, so
somebody did it obviously at that point to enhance the value of the car,
Yeah.
which is different. And the fact is right now there's a lot of dispute about cars that have been modified like that don't have the original parts but are sold as being the original car. And there's lawsuits about that every day.
Right.
And cars at auctions that get pulled out of auctions because they can't authenticate the history of the car. And so that is a very significant component of the car collecting world today. And part of that could be because there's too many lawyers. It could be because people are getting aware that there was so many cars that were modified. But you know, the main thing is that you need to represent it as to what it was when it was built, tell the truth, and let whoever's going to buy it decide what it's worth to them to buy the car.
Yeah, I have all the documentation when it was built, what was on it, so, and the parts. So, but now my second question is, when you go to the paint end of this, I just restored a '63 Le Mans. It had lacquer. It's totally original, but the paint was so bad it was kind of like that Buick that I repainted it. Now you got originally lacquer was on that car, and you can still get it and put it on the car, but you have other choices: base clear, single stage. Now they got water base. Is there any enhanced value if I repainted it in lacquer the way it originally was?
I don't think so. You know,
Okay,
lacquer's not durable. That's why
Right.
one of the reasons they don't use it today.
Yeah,
We're talking about the station wagon. We're trying to get the paint to look
Oh,
the
yeah.
same as the rest of the car,
Right.
not repaint the entire car.
I agree.
But in a case like what we do now, we're just doing a 34 Hispano Suiza. We did it in base clear coat
Okay.
because it looks great. The durability is astounding. The chemical resistance is astounding on the thing. When I first started restoring cars 30 years ago, I worked in a restoration shop and I had a rag with some lacquer thinner.
Mm-hmm.
And I was leaning on a car with the rag, and I was stupid at that time. I didn't realize what I was doing. Well, the rag stuck to the guy's car, ruined his paint.
Right.
That won't happen with modern
Right.
paints. So I don't see any reason, if you're doing a complete repaint on a car, to use the best product you can, which today, the only thing is with the clear coats of urethanes is they take an awful lot of effort to rub them out and get them actually flat, but it can be done. We color sand all of our panels out.
Right.
The 3 stages, and when they're rubbed, they're flat. There's no orange peel in them at all. So
I have to put water base on this with the urethane clear, and it's, you know, absolutely beautiful as far as.
yeah, I don't know about the water-based paints. I've only used them on one car, and I wasn't satisfied with the performance of it. The paint didn't seem to dry, but I've been told that the color matching is way better
Yeah, it's
from
awesome.
panel to panel. If you're using
Right.
metallic paints, then supposedly you can take that paint a year later, put it in the gun and spray it,
Right.
the colors will still.
Exactly, especially on metallics.
Right.
And then as far as drying, it's all airflow and humidity that slows it down. So
Right.
you have a lot of
That's what I
humidity
alluded
in
to
Michigan.
earlier about the enhancement versus restoration. Yeah, you probably go out in the field tomorrow, and I don't think you'll find a car out there that's competing for in a restored class that's got nitrocellulose lacquer on it.
Okay.
They just don't cut it. And even though they are enhanced, they'll probably still worth more. You know, my suggestion to you is do the car the way you would like it to be.
Right.
And you know, sometimes a correctly restored car may be worth more than an incorrectly restored car. I get people come in and they have a chance to buy a nice car, and it happens to be buckskin. And sorry if anybody owns a buckskin car, but
I have
sorry.
I painted it buckskin.
But as far as there are certain car colors are death on the market, and that's why they have colors like resale red available that people, and you can paint it the incorrect color and admit it's the wrong color, and it'll still be worth more. So my suggestion is if the car's not original, and it's not going to be original,
Do whatever you want.
make it something that that you would be proud of and that you like, and hopefully, when it's time to get rid of it, you'll find somebody else with similar taste.
Okay, thank you.
We have time for one more question.
Coming around the mountain, I said in the back.
They don't really run or they drive down the garage. You know,
The people in the back probably didn't hear that question, but basically is that, if you find a car that's apparently abandoned in the streets of Detroit and get it out and get it running, is that a smart thing to do? Is that your question? Okay, yeah.
Without a doubt, a running car is worth more than a non-running car. There's nothing worse than seeing them push a car across the auction block. It's scary. So if you can get it running and driving, the more power to you. That's definitely a valuable thing to do. And then you can even drive it and have fun with it. That's the first thing you have to do, is be able to have fun with your car. And unless you want to just sit there and look at it, which some people like to do too, but it's nice if you can hop in and drive it. And this car would be a blast to go drive around. And right now there's a car show down the street, the Concordia Le Mans, that this would be perfect for.
Best to show.
Yeah, it would best to show.
So, but again, you must figure out what the ultimate purpose is. If your purpose is to get it running and flip it and make a buck, fine. If it's to restore it, that's a different thing. If you want to have a nice one of these cars you can go out and be proud of, and go out to dinner on Saturday night and park it in front of a nice restaurant, look at what it might cost you to get there. So
I would suggest also, don't generalize. If you saw the presentation earlier about I don't know how many millions of dollars was spent on a 1911 Oldsmobile that looked like it was in complete shattered in shambles. And we see these outrageous prices paid for unrestored cars. I'm one of the biggest proponents of unrestored cars in the world, but there's a difference between high value unrestored cars and old used cars that are neglected. They're not the same. And you have to have the wisdom to be able to understand this is an old used car that's neglected. And if you think there's going to be a huge market out there for it, especially if it's a 1950s car, look at the people who can relate to 1950s cars today. Realize how many people out there in the marketplace have no idea who Johnny Carson is. Have no idea anything about anything before when they were born. And 1950 is so far back. It's one of the things we have to be careful about with these cars, is that just because it's a barn find does not mean it's going to be a collector's item. You have to be very discriminating about it and get with somebody, another collector or a good restoration company or somebody who's got some knowledge to keep from making mistakes of high degrees of generalizations about barn finds and survivors and things like that.
Well, I think this is the good news, though. I think this is the good news, that there's this whole other group of cars out there that actually are going to get a little bit of love. And the good news is they're going to survive another 10 or 20 or 30 years. And those otherwise, I mean, I go pull cars out of all sorts of places, and it's pretty quick how they go to nothing if they're not cared for. And a lot of those cars that we're talking about that aren't at the end of just being extremely well preserved, unrestored cars that you're going to take to a show field or great candidates for restoration at the moment. There's going to be a lot of these things sticking around, and I think that's good news.
Well, we have one question that we're going to go to before, so please, sir.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a multi-part question, if I could. 2 years ago, I bought a 1979 Lincoln Town Coupe, all original from the original owner. Had under 15,000 miles on it. Everything is in great shape on the car. It runs good. The original tires. I've got all the documentation. What I want to do is, though, because the car was up north, when it was it was driven in some gravel roads, a lot of paint chips on the front hood, the very front of the car, the flat front, the headlight doors and so on. I want to get that painted to make it look like it came out of the factory, number one. Number two, I want to clean up the engine a little bit, put the right clamps on it, the right hoses. There's a little bit of rust in some of the areas. If I do this stuff, will this take away from the statement that it's an unrestored original? That's my question.
I would say that you'd be surprised when you start working on cars how many of them, as I say, have been driven off bridges and into trees. And so your car, even though you think it's all the original paint on the car, unless you know the whole history of the car, so many cars are repainted right when they got to the dealer, where they had to spot in the fenders, they had to repair it. So I don't see that repairing the minor damage you're talking about on the car affects the originality enough to not do it. And then same thing inside the engine compartment. When those cars were new, they weren't rusty in there, and there's a limit to what you can do, but you're doing little minor maintenance things more so than any major restoration on the car.
Right,
So.
that's what it's just kind of cleaning it up,
Yeah.
housekeeping, and also underneath the carriage, you know, doing something underneath there. Would that be taking away also from the originality of it?
No, because the car's so good the way it is now, you're not changing anything. All you're
Okay,
doing
now
is
just
doing
cleaning up.
some service work, some maintenance.
Just cleaning up, that's all I want to do. I want to
Is
keep
that
that.
basically what you would say too, is the degree of what he's talking about?
Yeah, in the museum world, we have two sayings: less is more, and better is the enemy of good.
Okay.
So if you can get away with doing the least amount so you can still enjoy the car
Right.
and drive it safely, there's no reason to go any further.
Your car has a serious advantage too. It's relatively new. You may be able to get things like new old stock parts for whatever you wanted to replace in the engine compartment. Although you did say it had the original tires, I'd throw
Yes,
those away.
original
Or
tires.
put them in storage somewhere and put tires in that car before you drive it any further.
They're not.
They're probably spent. But there's probably a pretty good support for that car as well. A club support for Lincoln, the later Lincolns. You may want to look into that and see, you know, what other people are doing with it. Maybe they have some thoughts.
Okay.
I would give you a little different answer. If you tell me again, it's a 15,000 mile car? 100, I'm sorry, never mind.
I definitely save those tires and wheels, but I wouldn't drive with them.
Yep.
Yeah. But the stone chips, I'm okay with stone chips. Serial number 1 Mustang's got stone chips. That's part of its history.
Character.
It's supposed to look that way. You know, they drove it a few thousand miles. If it's got a few stone chips, let it age gracefully. If it didn't have stone chips, if anything, that would look a little more oddball. It looks weird.
Well, I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today. I'd like to thank you for coming. Again, we have David Burrows, Malcolm Cullum, Mark Kessler, Tim McNair, Warner Meyer, and Brian Josephs. Again, thank you, our panel. And thank you for coming.
Thank you.